everyone. Welcome to Briar Haus Writes. I'm Becky Parker, and tonight it is my esteemed pleasure to be able to have the State Poet Laureate for California with us, Mr. Lee Herrick. Lee, thank you so much for being part of our program.
Thanks for having me, Becky. It's nice to be here.
Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, let's see. I am a father and a husband and a professor, and I live in Fresno, California, which is kind of very central, kind of in between San Francisco and Los Angeles. Um, yeah, and I've been writing poetry for a number of years now, and I'm currently the California Poet Laureate.
Tell us what led you to your journey in writing. Was there any particular step that took you there, or were you always just fascinated with writing?
Um, That's a good question. I was a pretty curious child, I think. And I don't know if that had to do something with my upbringing. I was born in South Korea and adopted when I was 10 months old. So
Mhm.
raised by white people or Caucasian people as the only person of color in a family like that is gonna sort of, at least in my case, it kind of got my curiosity going. Um, But, I was also a big reader and I was surrounded by readers and creative people. My mother is an artist, and my father was a huge reader, and there were some educators in my family. And so I was surrounded by a lot of books. And, it just, when I remember when I started writing as a child, I remember it making me feel free, even at that young age. I remember feeling like I could just go and go and go and create and imagine things. So it felt kind of liberating even at a young age. And then, I got encouraged and nourished and supported by some wonderful teachers. But books have always been a big part of my life, and writing just felt like a natural extension of that. Um,
And so
and
you also are a professor. So you're mentoring other people to be able to read and write and get their creative juices
yeah.
flowing.
Yeah, this is my almost my 30th year teaching. So it's been a while, and I've felt very grateful to have a career in teaching. I teach at Fresno City College, which is a large community college. It's about maybe 25,000 students. And then I teach in an MFA program up by Lake Tahoe for the University of Nevada, Reno. And um, yeah, I love it. I've loved teaching. Felt very fortunate to have some wonderful students. Um,
What do you
and
hope that they've learned from you?
I think each student maybe is different at each level, but generally speaking, I hope that, on one hand, I hope they've learned some craft things,
Hmm.
right? Or some foundational parts to writing, whether it's what a person can do with a word or a sentence or pacing or punctuation or imagery, the different things, how craft can fuel their writing. But
Hmm.
also, I hope that to the extent that it would apply to their own lives, I hope that they've learned that they're capable of all kinds of things that they might not have thought possible. Um, and I don't just mean, say, like a publication. That's probably not the most important thing. But I think in terms of their own capabilities, their own imaginations, their own abilities to um, write something meaningful for themselves. I hope that some of my students have taken that from my classes.
Do you ever find any challenges in your own writing?
Oh, everywhere.
Like, for example, spill the tea. Tell
Yeah.
us everything.
Well, I mean, I think writing, I don't know about you or some of your listeners, but most writers I know, I think, share a similar feeling that writing is full of uh, rewards and joys, but certainly challenges. I think for me, in terms of writing challenges, sometimes it's just getting in the headspace and what or whatever one would want to call it, finding the time um, to be able to channel the ideas that are sort of floating around in your head or have been floating around in your heart, whatever it might be. I think day-to-day living can be a challenge, can feel antithetical to the arts or creating something, which I think requires great focus and some solitude. Um, and then there's just the challenge of saying it, finding the words to say it. Some things, it's a challenge on a craft level, like how can I get this line to work in a way that I'm hoping it will? But I think also it's just the challenge of like a longer term challenge that can be years, why a person might not start writing about something until she's 40 or
Hmm.
60. You know, we're not always ready to write the things that we might need to or want to write. So that's not a challenge of the hour or even the day. That's a challenge of 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 life circumstances and fear and other larger things that can keep us from the page.
And it sounds like maybe we need to give ourselves grace along that journey of those challenges.
Absolutely. We need to give ourselves grace. And I also think if we're not sure how, writing about it can lead us to it. Writing about it, however messy it might be, can lead us to that grace. I like that idea. Yeah.
And be therapeutic in the process, sounds like what you're saying.
I think so. I think so. I think among some purists, writers are sometimes quick to say, oh, it's not just about healing. It's not just about, the cathartic or the therapeutic effects, but it is some version of that. I call it liberating. Whatever works for the person, I think if it gives us some kind of joy, I think it's positive.
Well, Lee, tell us how you became poet laureate. I know you had been poet laureate for Fresno. How did you become the state poet laureate?
I was nominated and then I didn't think much of it because California is such a huge
It is
state.
huge.
Um, our state population is almost 40 million people. So there are a number of great poets who've done great work for so long. I didn't really think much of the nomination. I was humbled and happy to be nominated, but some months passed. It was probably 6 or 7 months passed. And then I got an email saying I was being advanced. And then soon after that, um, received a phone call from the governor's office, which was a surprise. And I remember my wife saying, this could happen. If they're calling you, this might actually happen. So, then I interviewed with about 6 people from the governor's staff. And long story short, then they notified me. It was a thrill. Um, the governor and his wife came to my classroom in Fresno, which was a thrill. And then there were a couple of other things. I had to go through a Senate confirmation. It's quite a process here in California. Um, but it has been an incredible joy. It's been a remarkable couple of years, and I feel very grateful to be able to serve in this position.
With a population as large as California and so many different styles and in genres of what people love in poetry, even, how do you manage to, give light to those voices that have so many different styles?
That's a good question. I feel like I'm fairly familiar with and love those different styles. It's one of the things that I love about California. So, for example, I think some people or some Californians, and I'm sure people outside of California have their opinion or experiences with our state. Some what I think sometimes is that it's a place of great bounty. You know, if you drive up the South Bay, there's the global headquarters for Google, eBay, Netflix, Facebook, this incredible, you know, when we became a state in 1850, we became the 31st state. It was right around the time of the gold rush. So there was literally bounty in the earth.
Right.
People came from all over the world to try to find the gold. And then, of course, the I think a lot of people think about, you know, movies and television. I also think of it as a great place of difficulty and struggle, Japanese internment, exclusion, violence, great poverty, um,
And right now, tremendous fire.
tremendous. I mean, you know, one writer used the word pyrocene, which, you know, we're living in the age of fire. And um, you know, Altadena, Pasadena, the Palisades, all those areas are just devastated. Um, and so that kind of displacement, that kind of difficulty here in the state, I think has always been a part of it. So to the poetics or to the wide-ranging poetry that we see here, it's a similar thing. You know, I've been to and I've curated readings that have been entirely in Spanish. Obviously, we have an incredible um, spoken word or slam poetry community. There are all kinds of great academic poets and page poets and formalists and narrative poets and you name it. But what I love about the position is I don't feel like I have to represent um, anyone or anything other than the best I can to support them and to advocate their love of poetry, what they're doing for themselves and their communities. Um, and that's been really amazing to see. So, you know, I've spoken or I've been parts of events at, you know, middle schools or any kind of school, college, university you could think of. I've spoken at some very official sort of fancy events, you know, political events.
Hmm.
I've spoken at state prisons and heard some poetry there. I'm here for all of it. I think poetry is boundless. I love working with seniors. I did a talk for a great organization called the Coalition to End Social Isolation and Loneliness. And so poetry, I think, can speak to all of those communities. I sort of embrace the range of it.
Well, you know, the neat thing about modern technology is we have Zoom. And I've spoke to the writer laureate of Alaska, and she says that one of the best ways that she can connect with such a big state of Alaska is through Zoom meetings, that she can reach the mom who wants to be a part and enrich her life, but she's got children, and so she's doing her, she's cooking while she's got her Zoom on. And so she just feels like
Hmm.
that was a great way to be able to go into the kitchen, go into the living rooms of people that she wouldn't necessarily, because it's such a large state, be able to be there in person. Do you
Hmm.
find that that is part of your experience as well, where you can reach more
Oh,
people through Zoom?
definitely. 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 I mean, I think some people were doing it before the pandemic, but I don't think nearly as many as there are now. And I'm often hesitant to talk about the positives that come out of such a traumatic global sort of experience. But, you know, all the schools went online in March 2020. And I've been really encouraged by the number of reading series um, and the number of options that Zoom or other kinds of uh, digital platforms open up. Um, you know, whether a person is physically challenged and not able to get around so they can
Mm.
do it from home.
Right.
Or there might be mobility issues. It might be age. It might be also, it could be issues of just geography. They don't live in a place where there's a reading series in a cafe or a bookstore or whatnot. So no, I love what this platform can do for people.
Well, Lee, would you read some of your work for us? I'd love to hear it.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Uh, let's see. So I thought I would read from my latest book, which just came out in September of last year. So it's pretty recent. It's called In Praise of Late Wonder, and it's a new and selected. So I'll read a I'll read a couple of older ones and then maybe some new poems. This is called Exile. Our natural state is not defensive or tense, but water in a resting state. We state this to be true in an age of inquiry, our failure to put what is just before ease. There are lovers in another country reclining by a fire, admitting love in a common language with faith in the exiles of their state, where a woman looks at her friend and says, please put down your bag and stay. Please stay to see how the movie ends. Take my hand. I think the city might go up in flames.
Mm.
Okay. Um, I think I'll just read some from the new section. So I was adopted from Korea when I was about 10 months old. And um, I was adopted into a white family, Caucasian family who were living in the Bay Area, with whom I'm still very close. Um, my father just turned 85, and my mother just turned 82. This is a sort of a prose poem titled Home. Home is the space around your heart, like a moat, so that the space in your heart or your spirit can have room to breathe, to be and become more of who you are. We know at a young age what hurts: rocks, names, being ignored. Over time, some remain and some change, as home might, but we must protect our home, our identities, what we know to be most true. Within that, there's a lot of space, in my home at least, for discovery, risk, exploration, safe argument. One could say that's a class or economic luxury, and they'd be right. But I'd say space is always important. Space in your heart, room in your mind. When I say I have missed my birth mother and father every day of my life, I mean that as a person of color raised in a white family, I was constantly and acutely aware of physical difference and what that could mean. Along with home and country and family and language, as a child, I was separated from the right to grieve. Adoption as a one-dimensional, one-way avenue toward gratitude and fortune is illogical and harmful. I recently read a book by a noted novelist whose father died when she was in her 50s. She was understandably grieving. She said, how do I continue with such an absence? I thought, here is the adopted person's situation from infancy. This loss, this massive absence is thrust upon them from the moment of separation. I call it an inverted grief thrust upon the adoptee. Home is where you are understood or loved or able to be weird, strange, confused, your lost self, your full human self. Mostly, I felt at home. Sometimes I felt so alone I could almost vanish.
When you first wrote that, do you remember how old you were? You said this was in your recent book, but do you remember when you first began to be aware of all those feelings of what home was?
Um, the first time I started feeling that way and thinking about home like that was well into adulthood. I mean, probably just as I was crafting that poem maybe 5 years ago,
Mm.
you know. Um, but as the poem sort of refers to, it, it mostly felt, it almost always felt safe and comfortable. But and maybe in everyone's home, there are times of difference and those questions. So it felt good to write that, where you're loved, or, you can be confused, or you can be your weird self, and that's okay. Home, I think, should have that sort of scope. Um,
That safe space.
yeah, yeah.
It sounds like you have that in your own home, which I think is really cool.
I hope,
I'm
I
sure you
hope.
do. I think your wife probably would have told you by now. And I know your kids would.
That's pretty good. It's quite a journey, I talk with adoptees sometimes, or I'll give talks at adoption conferences, and um, I'm always thinking good things and hoping for good things for adoptees everywhere.
Me too.
Yeah. Um,
And not just adoptees, but blended families, you know,
yeah.
where you have such different personalities and they're merging together, and every one of them wants to feel safe and supported.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Different kinds of families. And also, I think I would add to it a group, and it's maybe one more way among an infinite number of ways, I think, that women in this culture are stigmatized. And that is women who have placed children for adoption. I mean, I think
Exactly.
of good things for them always too. So, yeah. And it's been encouraging, there's a growing body of literature by adoptees, which is good to see. I'll read one more of these. Well, maybe I'll read a sonnet and then one more short prose poem.
Okay.
Okay. Um, this is the title poem from the book. It's titled In Praise of Late Wonder. I've wondered what my Korean mother's voice sounded like when I was born. Was it gasp, hiss, or flag in light wind? I've wondered if she kissed me before I became a wind, a white noise in blue sky. I've wondered lately about joy, butterfly, hummingbird, angels so full of bliss they almost sing. I imagine some of this relates to the orphan I was, the adopted boys and girls like me, all diaspora and alarm. I've wondered if I'm made of smoke and fire, sometimes clear sky, sometimes quiet storm. I've wondered lately how the acoustic guitar keeps its secrets, makes me float a little higher. How could I not love looking at the stars? And let's see, I'll just read this last one. This is another prose poem of sorts, and it's the last poem in this section of adoption poems. It's titled Stars. Every now and then, I remember that I was born on the other side of the earth, and it makes sense that I love looking up at the stars. It's such a childish thing to do, like climbing trees or stomping in mud puddles. But there's some strange pull and simple satisfaction from looking at the stars after all these years. I wonder if a man my age in Korea has the same love. I wonder how the stars relate to a gravitational likelihood that I'll tell my daughter someday about the time in our backyard, swimming in the moonlight, and the world seemed perfect. Or the time I dropped her off at her middle school in Fresno, and before I drove off, she motioned for me to stop and fogged up the window with her breath and wrote with her finger, "I love you, Dad," with a heart, and the world seemed perfect. That's what it is about the stars. Because they are so many millions of miles away and so still, the immediate chaos or confusion of our lives seems so minor. Even in the daylight, they're right there, imperceptible, but there. Something like faith or belief or the wild idea that a deep kind of joy is there for you, even if you have no idea where it is.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Lee, what advice would you give to an aspiring writer? Maybe some, because you talk to writers every day, you teach them. So, what advice do you give them that would propel their work to a new level?
It's a good question. I mean, just generally speaking, since the levels can vary,
How about just from getting off that page?
yeah. I mean, let's see. So I think there's a lot one can do. You know, and these are in no particular order, but I think reading contemporary poetry is essential. Just like a musician who's wanting to improve her playing
Hmm.
or learn more about the instrument or the genre, she's going to listen to music of the time, right? And so sometimes when a person says, "Oh, I don't want it to interfere with my vision," it's the opposite. It will help us. So that's one thing. I would encourage a person to read contemporary poetry widely, meaning across experience. If I only read poems by Korean adoptees, right? Or if I only read California poets or poets my age or my orientation or my, yeah. So read widely as one
Hmm.
can. I think also uh, some kind of writing support. And I think it can be anything from just a couple of people. It doesn't have to be a big group. Um, if it's local, that's good, or if it's online, that can be good. There are all kinds of free or relatively affordable classes. There are great reading series like this one, where, I've looked at your back catalog and there's some wonderful talks. So a person can just sort of hear poets talking about the writing craft. But if you're getting feedback, I do think it's important, Becky, for anyone to have feedback from someone who is a little bit beyond them,
Right.
or at the very least, someone who's writing at a similar level who can do a few things. One, encourage you and support you, um, and maybe be able to talk about writing with you. But I think it's very important to be able to have someone and to be able to take some constructive criticism and feedback. Because just Lee, you're great. Lee, you're good. Lee, this poem is wonderful is not probably going to help me too much in the long run. I mean, that stuff isn't good, but um,
You don't want to put a big F on their paper before you tell them exactly what it is that could maybe make it better. That's the
yeah,
hardest thing for writers, though, is that vulnerability to be able to get
yes,
out of that and think, okay, I've just bared my soul to you, but how can I
yeah.
get better about it?
And that's important because if it is this soul bearing kind of thing, you want to have someone who's mindful of that and not just attack and tear it to shreds. What I always tell my students is you are not the poem. Even if you're writing about something personal, you're not the poem. So that if someone says, "Oh, I'm not so sure about this opening line," right? that doesn't mean they don't like you or you're not worthy or you're a good poet. So, in other words, ways to develop that thick skin to, especially if it's feedback from somebody that you respect and you know is got your best interest in mind, to be able to look at it as a writing thing, not a personal attack.
Sounds
Um,
like you need to write
and
a book on how to get rid of that thick skin or how to develop that thick skin. That would be really
yeah,
helpful.
it's very important to turn the corner,
It is
right, in your writing. Um,
because
don't,
some people can be stuck right here at this place and they don't get past that.
yes, yes.
So yeah, that's
And
a very good advice. I
you know,
love
and
that.
what I'll ask my students too, especially at the graduate level, is are you wanting this kind of feedback and do you not take it personally? You know, and then, I can kind of calibrate how much this person's ready to work on the poems. I think we're all wonderful, you're all wonderful people, but the extent to which a person's ready to work on the poems, I think can correlate to their potential growth as a poet.
I think that's
Um,
very good advice.
yeah. And then just some other things off the page, I would say just explore new things, you know.
Try
Um,
new forms.
Try new forms. Don't be afraid to get strange in the poems, make it up, have fun, invent, um, and always be true to yourself um, and try to enjoy it too.
Well, Lee, speaking of enjoyment, I have really enjoyed our time together. And before we go, will you tell everyone where you can be found?
Yes. Well, I've enjoyed it too, Becky. So thank you for having me. I'm only on one social media platform, which is Facebook. But I do have a website. It's just leeherrick.com. And there's some interviews and articles and a calendar and different things like that. Um,
And
and there's
also,
some information.
if you
Uh,
Google you, you can find lots of interviews that you've done. You've been really
oh,
busy. You've been really busy in your two
it's
years of being poet laureate.
it's been busy, but it's really been a joy too. Yeah, I appreciate it, Becky.